Hi, I'm Josh Berthume, founder of Swash Labs, a digital communications firm, and Rogue Metrics, a research group focused on digital risk. In this video, we're going to talk about digital risk. I want to describe the digital risk environment that we currently live in, how to mitigate digital risk, and as an individual, how to proactively practice digital risk awareness. I'm going to share some observations and some insights and some best practices to help get you equipped for living and working digitally at the speed of politics in the 2020 election cycle. It is not possible to entirely eliminate digital risk, but by following these steps and embracing these best practices, you can stack the odds in your favor and significantly reduce the digital risk both to you and your organization. So first of all, why are we talking about this? Why is digital risk mitigation important? The first reason is that most organizations are ill-prepared for the current digital risk environment. Generally, they don't tend to think of modern digital risks in the right way. This isn't their fault. Some of this is because of tradition. Some of it is because of technological debt. A lot of these boats are sort of hard to turn with the big organizations, and that trickles down to smaller groups and product availabilities and all that sort of stuff. Many people and organizations tend to think of cybersecurity as conflated with network security or IT security, and they imagine that the main risks that they need to be concerned about are computer viruses or targeted hacking or network intrusion, but the risk environment has expanded. Certainly you can still get hacked. Certainly people are still trying to gain access illicitly to networks and systems. But most current digital risks tend to exploit behavior rather than infrastructure. That's why phishing is such a big risk, because that's not necessarily a network or an infrastructural risk. That's counting on you to be on autopilot while you're checking your email. It's much more likely that someone's going to take advantage of bad habits or personal behaviors in order to try and compromise a system or an organization. Also, piecemeal solutions are inadequate. Sometimes an organization, especially one that's pressed for time or resources, will put an antivirus program or an endpoint security system or a two-factor requirement in place for some or one of their platforms and just sort of feel like they have it covered. That's certainly better than nothing, but it doesn't fix everything. Also, all organizations are vulnerable to these kinds of risks, and that means political, corporate, institutional, nonprofit, governments, like every single kind of organization. If you communicate digitally, if you send information back and forth using the internet, any kind of electronic devices, every organization is susceptible to these kinds of risks. The good news is, though, that a behavioral approach can mitigate a lot of these risks. Thinking about it behaviorally in terms of personal operations security starts at the personal level. But by putting those best practices in place and getting people to engage in digital risk thinking at the personal level, that tends to work its way into an organization adopting a culture of digital risk awareness, and that can help both the individual and the organization mitigate a lot of digital risk. My goal in this video is to describe these risks simply enough so that everyone can understand them, and then to dig just deep enough into the details so that everyone can learn how to mitigate them. We're going to start by describing the risk environment, and then we're going to get into mitigation techniques and tools after that. So to begin with, the basic big picture vulnerabilities, the biggest vulnerabilities in our current digital risk environment are as follows. First of all, it's file sharing, access, and security. Literally how you decide who has access to files and documents that you're working on. Then website security, unsecured Wi-Fi networks and how you access and interact with them, malware and phishing, and then device security. All right, so file sharing is a big one for small organizations. This is small companies, this is political campaigns, this is anybody that needs to work collaboratively on documents, be able to share information at speed with other organizations or with volunteers or with people that are working on a lot of different projects at once. That need for expedience and the frictionless sharing and access of information creates a big risk. This is environments like Dropbox, this is Google Docs, this is anything where you and your team can work collaboratively on a set of documents. Now, people in fast-moving organizations, again, with volunteers, allied groups, a lot of times they will have access to drives and files that they don't actually need. Sometimes this happens because things get shared quickly and haphazardly out of a perceived need for experience. Everyone gets in the habit of going fast and doing things with as little friction as possible so that files are shared without much thought or intentionality, and this is where we really get into trouble. When a new person comes into the organization, when a volunteer shows up and wants to help, you don't necessarily want to gate what they have access to out of sort of the just-in-case mindset of they might need access to the master donor list someday, or maybe this information that might be sensitive or confidential. So people will get shared into the whole drive or a big group of files that they don't necessarily need. Then often what happens is when a person doesn't need that access anymore, and that access by itself is problematic to begin with, just because people shouldn't have access to things they don't need to have access to. But then sometimes people leave the organization, or allied groups stop working with you, or vendors or contractors or consultants stop working with your group, and then that access will stay. That access will be maintained, and people that aren't even associated or affiliated with your group or your organization anymore will still have access to your files and your shared directories. That can spell trouble in the long run. Another significant risk element in this environment is website security. Small political groups, nonprofits, especially political campaigns, very often will have websites developed or built for them by family members or friends at a severe discount or for free. And that's fine, but what isn't fine is that in a lot of cases, those websites are built on content management systems that require management. For instance, a content management system like WordPress requires updates. You've got to update the WordPress framework, you have to update plugins, and if those things aren't updated, then that creates security vulnerabilities. WordPress isn't alone. A lot of content management systems work like that. This is just sort of a modern reality. This is the same way that your devices need updates. WordPress is a robust system that is great for a lot of things, but it has to be managed. You have to update those things. When those things don't get updated, it makes the website vulnerable to all kinds of compromise, and that can create all kinds of problems. Next up is unsecured Wi-Fi networks. Now, any unsecured Wi-Fi network, whether it's at home, at a coffee shop, in an airport, at a hotel, they all carry the risk of device or data compromise. And when I say an unsecured Wi-Fi network, that means either one that you don't have to enter a password in order to use, or one that is just sort of publicly available with minimum security. At home or at work, it's rare, but an unsecured or unmanaged internet or Wi-Fi connection can represent a breach vulnerability, but unsecured Wi-Fi connections out in public at hotels, airports, coffee shops, those are much more risky. Moving on to malware and phishing. These are a risk category that you are likely to be familiar with because malware tends to fall under the category of what your antivirus is there for. That is when you get a Trojan or a virus on your computer that does malicious things to your data. Ransomware also falls into that category, and then also less likely to affect an individual, but also very dangerous is the advanced persistent threat, where a malicious actor will put some code on your computer that doesn't immediately crash everything or lock you out or cause problems, but rather it sort of sits there to be activated at a later date. So that anything that's you think of traditionally as a virus falls under sort of malware with some extra added things. Phishing is extremely common. It's the most, it's sort of the most focused upon threat in corporate security right now, and that's because it's so sinister and doesn't take a whole lot of resources in order to gin up a phishing attack, but it can be very destructive. This is when you get an email that looks like it is from a trusted source, and it is, it's a spoofed email from Google or Microsoft or some big platform asking you to log in and sort of serving up an opportunity for you to put your login credentials into an email, and then you log in, and it's actually been, someone has compromised you now, and they have your login for whatever that platform is. So that's a distinct threat from malware, but it is also very dangerous. Finally, The last element in sort of the big picture of vulnerabilities are security updates and device security. Now this is on the individual level. This is literally security vulnerabilities in device operating systems and platforms where your computer will ask you for an update. Most of the time, that is about security. Sometimes when your phone software or your operating system on your computer asks for an update, you're going to get night mode or some new functionality or something. But most of the time, it's about patching a security breach that's been discovered in the operating system for whatever device that you're using. These updates not being applied, these security breaches that sort of hang and kind of gather speed in the ecosystem of all the desktops and laptops and phones and devices that are being used, those have contributed to many significant breaches and hardware compromises over the last several years.